Story 1. Private security was my field until a few years ago. When I say security, I don't mean mall officers, but high-end, armed, trained security. I spent a few years working a job in another city away from home, but the company went under, so I decided to move back home. I found a security job online. It was simple entry-level work, basically sitting behind a computer. You were security for the building but monitored security for other sites the company owned across 3 states, like small repair places, factories, and places where they stored vehicles. So I submitted my resume. The next day, a guy called and set up an interview, which was awesome because I needed to find work fast. I went to the interview, conducted by a woman I'll call Jane. She was the supervisor, and the guy I talked to was her boss. Jane immediately told me I was way overqualified, which I found strange, but okay. The interview went fine, and I left. A few hours later, she called and said I was hired and set up training days. Now, I won't go through that. I just wanted to give background, so let's go to the good parts. She always gave me a cold shoulder. Her boss found out I had all the qualifications, licensing, and training to be armed, so he had me come in armed. Nothing fancy, a handgun, 3 magazines, and handcuffs. She would always make comments about how everyone should be armed. A few of my coworkers I wouldn't trust with a water gun, and she should decide who is armed. Just little comments to get under my skin. Then one day, it happened. I was working the front desk reception that day, and she sent me a message over Messenger telling me she needed to see me. I went back, and she dragged me to a side office with a write-up form. Apparently, when I added door access to a visitor's badge, I added the door to the gym in the basement, a mistake, but not life-threatening. A week later, I didn't sign my timesheet, another for not filling in a form correctly. All minor things everyone has done or did. The end came about 9 months into the job when I looked at the new timesheet. I was paired with a new officer who had been there a month, only he was listed as shift supervisor. Confused, I took it to her second in command. I'll call him Bob, a great guy. He told me that he brought it up, that I had the experience and seniority to be promoted, and she basically told him to get lost. It was her choice. Anyway, that got me mad, so I started planning my revenge. I don't normally do this, but I knew one more write-up, and I would be fired no matter how minor the infraction was. The good thing is during the night shift, there are only 2 people, and we can't see each other's computers, so I started thinking. I remembered about 4 months prior, her car broke down in the parking lot across the street. Instead of having it towed, Jane's father decided to fix it there. No big deal. Only during that time, Jane was bringing her husband back into the security office. This was a huge deal. The office took scanning at 3 doors and a keypad to enter. In the whole building, only the security staff and 1 cleaning guy had access. It was the headquarters for the company, and not even the executives had access. From our computers, we could open any door, turn off any camera or alarm, and open any gate in any building that the company owned. So it was a big deal because we had the keys to the kingdom. That was a huge violation, so I hatched my plan. Under the excuse of having a smoke, I went out to reception and copied the visitor log from those days. I then went back in and accessed the video feeds. You could go back a year for all video feeds, and I took screenshots of her husband entering the doors and office. The office itself had no camera. I also got timestamps of him leaving and the fact he never swiped in, which, even if someone holds the door open for you, you must scan your card. I logged onto my private email and sent it to another email, knowing they don't log what you do on the computers. I got home and sent all the pictures, the log copies, and everything to not only her boss, but his boss, whose job was investigating breaches and theft. I also included every dirty trick she pulled playing favorites. The fallout didn't take long. 2 days later, on Friday, I went in for an afternoon shift, and Bob was at Jane's workstation. I looked confused and said Jane was suspended for a week, and that Monday I had to come in and speak with her boss and boss's boss, but I would be paid for it. Also, everyone was interviewed. There were great rumors flying. I was laughing on the inside. Okay, interview day. I went in, and they started questioning me. They knew I worked while she brought her husband in and asked me. I spilled everything after acting scared and getting assurances it would be confidential and I wouldn't be punished. I didn't tell them I sent it, but they asked everyone. I left out some things in the email and added some things that weren't. I didn't want to be labeled as a snitch. It went on for an hour, and I left. The next day, an email was waiting. Jane was fired, Bob was in charge until a replacement was added. I had a long talk with Bob that day. Turns out Jane was scared of me because I was more qualified for her job than she was and knew I was her boss's golden boy. She was afraid, rightfully so it turned out, that I might take her job and admitted to him she wanted me gone. A fact he told them in his interview. Also, she didn't want to hire me, but her boss made her. Turns out her boss was aware of things and looking for an excuse to fire her, but it had to be big. Jane had been working at that department for 10 years. It was her first real job, and security was all she knew. They blacklisted her, which means unless a company was really desperate, she wouldn't get a security job anywhere in the state. Icing on the cake. I know you want to know. Yes, I was offered her job. No, I didn't take it. I told him that Bob deserved it more, he did, and that I would be happy being a shift supervisor. So that's what I stayed for the next 2 years until I left. Story 2. This may be pushing Rule 6 a little, but this happened when my grandfather was growing up in rural Kansas in the 40s and 50s, and it is one of my favorite stories from him. When my grandpa was growing up, he didn't have electricity, this being rural Kansas. What they did have was a wood-burning stove. At one point, firewood that great-grandfather had been storing began to disappear. A thief was afoot. My great-grandfather, getting tired of the firewood disappearing, hatches a plan. Great-grandfather takes some of the logs and drills them out, leaving a cavity. He then puts some explosive powder in the cavities and plugs the holes to hide his handiwork. That night he tells my grandpa that he would bring in the firewood. Of course, he knows which logs he's messed with. Now this is the funny part, and I wish I knew how embellished it was, but stranger things have happened. The next day, the great-grandfather is walking into town and comes across a gentleman also headed into town, and they get to talking. It turns out the gentleman is going into town to make a purchase. The item he seeks, a new stove. He says to my great-grandfather, "I don't know what they're putting in the coal these days, but it destroyed my stove." No wood ever went missing again. Story 3. My grandma told me this story recently about how her brother got his comeuppance from the grave. So this is the scenario. My grandma comes from a family of 5, 4 girls, 1 boy. My great-grandfather Hank was ecstatic with the boy. We will call him Jack. One more important thing is that my great-grandfather ran a very successful company that made high-end clothing and bathroom silks/towels/bathrobes. He made a fortune with his company and made sure everyone who worked for the company got their fair share. He also looked after the family. All his children got an education, and all his children got the chance to get their driver's license. It was in the 1960s, so it was a big deal back then. They were the first in my hometown with a car, radio, and TV. My great-grandfather treated everyone equally. That changed when his first and only son was born. He already had 4 girls, and now finally a son. The roadmap was laid out for him. He would be the heir to his company. So began the upbringing of Jack. He was, let's say, a kid with a mouth. This wasn't bad per se. The thing was that his father allowed it. Jack got kicked from his first school. Jack got caught for shoplifting. Jack got kicked from his second school. Jack got caught joyriding, and so on and so on. Hank did not sit Jack down and tell him the severity of his actions, but he would shrug it off and tell his wife, great-grandmother Anna, that it was just childhood quirks. Anna tried to make something out of Jack, but it was a lost cause. Jack became 18, and Hank decided that it was time to introduce him to the company. The company did better than ever, and the whole family was involved. Jack began at the bottom of the ladder and had to work his way up. This is where Jack began to shine. By shine, my grandmother meant that her brother was not a bright light at school, but he was a hard worker and had a nose for business, not so much for people. Jack was being a jerk as per usual and got married to his first difficult wife. His first wife wanted to start her own company, and her father-in-law, Hank, wanted to retire. She pushed Jack to take over quickly and push the rest of the family out. Jack listened to her and talked to his father about how he was ready and how his sisters and their husbands were tearing the company apart if they would stay in their leadership roles. The thing was that only one daughter and son-in-law were involved in the company at this point 1980. My grandmother oversaw the seamstresses and the quality department, and my grandfather oversaw the financial and the suppliers. The difficult wife wanted full control and started a little fire in the family. She spread a rumor that grandfather stole from the company. I do not know what transpired, but in the end, my great-grandfather bought out all the family, and Jack bought out great-grandfather. The company was Jack and his wife's company now, and things went crazy pretty quickly. Seamstresses quit, bills were not paid, and Jack had to take a loan from great-grandfather. The family company was barely scraping by, and the difficult wife left Jack because he could not provide for her. It became apparent that Jack could not make it work and was looking for a way out. After a while, great-grandfather had seen enough and bought back the remnants of his company and sold it to a bigger company that wanted to expand. This made the wealth he made even bigger. He did set up different banking accounts for his children and said that if someone was in need, they could take money from that account. He told Jack his cut was smaller as he was the reason he sold the company and that he was let down by the carelessness with which his son had run his company into the ground. Jack was angry and told his father that he could have made it work if he had more time. It remained a sour point between the two of them. Things went well for a while, but Jack married a second time with a woman named Helen. Helen, like the difficult wife, wanted her own business. Jack agreed and took money from the account in order to start Helen's company. The business was a little barbershop and ran pretty well. They were spending their money on luxury and did not save any money. After a while, my grandmother got a call from her little brother Jack if he could store some goods in her garage. My grandfather did not trust Jack and told him no, and grandmother did not agree, but they agreed to it. A few weeks later, Jack got caught for possession of stolen goods and smuggling forbidden substances. It was not a surprise, but nonetheless a letdown for my great-grandfather Hank. This time he would not help Jack and told him that he would no longer stand behind him. After a few years, Jack got out and was again a divorced man. He married again and divorced another 3 times, and each time he gave these women a business and lived lavishly. New cars, big houses, expensive vacations. He drained his money and robbed his emergency bank account dry. He loaned a lot of money from great-grandfather and so on. In 2013, great-grandfather fell ill. It was clear that he was not going to make it and took his final days in stride. At this time, Jack became very buddy-buddy and started to help great-grandfather sell some stuff. At some point, my grandmother sat down with her father and asked him where the money went for the sold stuff, and great-grandfather told her not to worry about it. He took care of it in his will. After his 95th birthday, he passed away quietly and in peace. After the funeral, they all went to listen to the will of their father, all except Jack, who had given a power of attorney to my grandmother to sign the will in his place. All the children get their fair share, but at the end, the notary public tells them to sign the papers, and the inheritance is completely theirs. At some point, my grandma called my dad. She has inherited some collateral papers, all sorts of papers that stated that someone owed my great-grandfather money. My father said that she has to call a lawyer's office to get the money from these papers. A few days after this call to the lawyer's office, my grandmother gets a call from her brother, asking why she was taking his money from the inheritance. My grandmother tells him she has inherited some collateral papers and that she wants to get the money from them. Jack was furious and told her that that was illegal. Jack was wrong. Great-grandfather had documented every penny his son had loaned from him and constructed his will in such a way that the rest of his children could get that part of their money from their money-draining brother. Also, great-grandfather found out Jack stole from him. You see, Jack was putting the money he made from the sold stuff in his own banking account instead of giving it to his father. After this ordeal, Jack has not contacted my grandmother or his sisters. He has since then paid everything back and has never seen a penny from his inheritance. Great-grandfather had confided in a letter why he did this. He was done with his son, all the lying, the careless things he had done to his company, all the money he had blown, and not taking any responsibility. He gave his final lesson to his son from the grave.